Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for Module 14. We're going to talk about our last thing with chords, which is triad and seventh chord inversions, and we'll talk a little bit more about a couple more things too. So after you watch this video, we'll be able to understand the process of inverting chords. We'll be able to use figured bass and also bass position symbols to identify inversions. We'll be able to identify a chord with lead sheet symbols. And we'll also be able to recognize chords that are spread across more than one staff. All right, so let's talk about inverting chords. So any part of a triad or a seventh chord can be the lowest pitch of a chord. Okay, so all the chords we've dealt with so far have had the root as their lowest note, as their lowest sounding note. But any of the notes of the triad can actually be the lowest note in the triad. And when a different note is in the bass, right, in the lowest voice, it doesn't change the kind of triad it is. The only thing that changes is the notes are rearranged a little bit. So here, this is a triad with a root in the bass, but you can invert it by taking that root and moving it up an octave, just like you would invert a interval. Okay, so you're just flipping part of the chord up an octave. And now a different note is in the bass, right? It's the third. So before we had a root position triad. Now we've moved that root note up an octave. So now the third is in the bass, right? And you can hear it still sounds like a D minor triad, right? Nothing's really changed about it, except we have a different note in the bass, in the lowest voice. You can do it again. You can take that third, raise it up an octave, and now the fifth of the chord is in the bass. And again, it doesn't really change the quality or type of triad, but all the notes have been rearranged so that a different note of the triad is the lowest note. But these are all still D minor triads. Okay, so triads can be in 3 different positions or inversions. Each one has a different part of the triad as its lowest pitch. So here is an F major triad. And since the root of this triad is also the lowest note, we call this a root position triad. Now this is considered, the basic form of a triad. So whenever we think about triads, we think about them in root position. Okay, we name them after root position. They work in music in a root position kind of way, right? So they're kind of like the default form of a triad. Okay, if the third is in the bass, we call it the first inversion. So this is what we call it first because this is what you get after the root position by taking the lowest note and moving it up an octave. So we've taken that root, which was F, and moved it to the top of the chord. So now the third of the chord is in the bass. Right? And you can do that again, and if the fifth is in the bass, so we've taken that A and moved it up an octave, now the fifth of the chord is in the bass. So we've inverted it twice, so we call this second inversion. Okay? So root position is when the root of the triad is the lowest note. First inversion is when the third of the triad is the lowest note. And second inversion is when the fifth of the triad is the lowest note. And like I said, these are all the same triad. They're just in different positions. So these are all still F major triads. We just say that the first one is an F in root position. The second one is an F major triad in first inversion. And the last one is an F major triad in second inversion. So we needed a way to identify triads, or identify the positions of triads and seventh chords, which we'll talk about in a second. But what's really different about them, since they don't have a different name, but they do have different intervals. So depending on what position a triad is in, it will have different intervals relative to the lowest note, which we also call the bass note. Okay, so from now on, I'll kind of refer to the lowest note of the chord as the bass note. Okay? And so in root position, we already know what the intervals are in a root position triad. They are a third from the base, and they're also a fifth from the base. So I'm going to take those and write them as numbers underneath of the chord. Okay? So this is just telling me that I need, in order to spell a root position triad, I need to add a third above the note G, right? Because this is bass clef. And I need to add a fifth above the note G. And if I do that, I will end up with a root position triad with G as the lowest note. Okay? And so you can even use a shorthand where we could just write the note and put a number under it. And that would indicate that would tell us what intervals we need to add. And so that would indicate that this needs to be a root position triad. So this is what we call a figured bass. And a figured bass is kind of an old-fashioned way of indicating what intervals need to be played or added to an existing bass note. And we use it as mostly as a shorthand to indicate what position a triad or another kind of harmony is given a bass note. Okay? So the numbers 5, 3 can be used to indicate something is in root position, because the only thing that will have a fifth and a third is a root position triad. Okay? So the figured bass is a bass note, in this case G, and it's also a set of numbers underneath of that note that tell you what intervals will be used to create that chord. And those intervals indicate what position it's in. So we can do the same thing with a first inversion chord. So here we have the note B, and for a first inversion triad, we have to add a third above that note B. And then we also need to add a sixth above that note B. And the numbers we could use to represent that would be a 6 and a 3. So we could come up with a shorthand for a first inversion triad with a bass note and the numbers 6, 3, which tell us that we need to add a third and a sixth. And that can also stand for a first inversion triad. Same with second inversion. So second inversion has a fourth above the bass note. It also has a sixth above the bass note. So we can use the numbers 6, 4 underneath of a note to indicate that something is in second inversion. And so we use the number 6, 4 to stand for a second inversion triad. Now, with figured bass, there's a little bit more of a shortcut. So since 5 and 3 are so common, often in an actual figured bass, which we'll deal with in a little bit later on in the semester, you won't see any numbers at all. So if you see a G by itself, that will indicate that it's a root position triad. So whenever you see a note without any numbers, that implies that the fifth and the third need to be added. Same with the first inversion. Since 3 is normally something we add, we'll often leave that out from the actual figured bass, and we'll just write a 6. And 6, 4, since that's, you need to have both of those indicated, we'll still write the full number. Okay, so those are kind of just the abbreviations or shorthands for the same thing that's above. Now, a bass position symbol is related to a figured bass symbol, but it's a little bit different in the way it's used. So a bass position symbol is used with another symbol, which we'll talk about later, called a Roman numeral, or sometimes it'll be with the name of the chord itself. But it will also always be attached to something else that indicates which chord we're talking about. So all of these numbers, these bass position symbols, will be written above and to the right of these other symbols. Now, I'm just giving the Roman numeral I, which stands for 1, as an example, but these can be attached to any Roman numeral or other symbol. So, for example, for first inversion, if we wanted to indicate that that chord indicated by that I, right, is in first inversion, we use the number 6. And if we wanted to indicate that the chord all the way on the right, which would be indicated by I, if we want to say that that chord is in second inversion, we just add the numbers 6, 4 above to the right of that chord. Okay? And then if something is in root position, again, we don't add anything to it at all. We just leave the symbol by itself. Okay? And we'll talk more about those symbols, those numerals later. But I grade them out because they're not part of the base position symbol. They're independent. So when we're talking about the base position symbol, if something is in first inversion, it doesn't need to be I6. It can be 5-6, or it can be the 6-6, right? It can have any kind of symbol for that bottom part. But the number is what we're talking about when we're talking about the base position symbol. So let's talk about the inversions for seventh chords. So since seventh chords have 4 notes, there are 4 possible positions that a seventh chord can be in. The first is the one we're used to, which is root position, and that obviously has the root in the bass. And the intervals that happen in a root position seventh chord are a third, a fifth, and a seventh. So the full figured bass we'd use for this would be 7, 5, and 3. But since that's a lot to write, we will often just abbreviate it as a 7. So if you see the note G on the staff with a 7 under it, that indicates that we're going to be spelling a seventh chord. Okay? And then you'd also include the 5 and the 3. First inversion is what we get when the third of the chord is in the bass. Right? See, it still has the same sound as the seventh chord. But now the third is in the bass. So the intervals in this inversion are a third, a fifth, and a sixth. So it's actually pretty close to what we had before, but now the sixth is the seventh, or the seventh is the sixth. And so the full figured bass would be a 6-5-3. And we'll often leave out the 3 and just write 6-5. So if you see a note with a 6-5, that means what they're writing a first inversion seventh chord. Second inversion, now the fifth is in the bass. And so the intervals in this inversion are a third, a fourth this time, and again a sixth. Okay? And so the full figured bass for this would be 6-4-3. And we'll often write that in a short form as 4-3. And then our last inversion has the seventh in the bass. Okay. And you can see now we have a second between our bass note and the next part of the chord. And then a fourth between the seventh, the lowest note, and the next part of the chord. And then we also have a sixth again. So this, for the full figured bass for this would be 6-4-2, but we will abbreviate that as 4-2 most of the time. Okay? And so the bass position symbols are related to these same things. And notice I'm using the Roman numeral 5 this time. So the letter V stands for 5 in Roman numerals. But again, it can be any Roman numeral or any other symbol indicating a chord. So for a root position chord, we'll just write the 7 above that symbol. For first inversion, we'll just use 6-5 above that symbol. And for second inversion, we'll use 4-3 above that symbol. And finally, for third inversion, we'll use the numbers 4-2 above that, right? And so what's really useful about the numbers is if you're given a bass note and you have to figure out how to quickly write whatever inversion they want, you don't really have to figure out the root position form and then flip it all around, right? If you're given the numbers, you can just figure out what the intervals would be above that note. And so it's a really fast way of knowing how to spell different chords in different positions, especially seventh chords, I think. It's really helpful for that. All right, so a couple more things. We're going to talk about lead sheet symbols, and we've talked about this a little bit before with the chord symbols. But a lead sheet symbol is another way to indicate a chord, and they're often seen above the staff of a notated melody. So here's an example of a lead sheet. You can see that there is a melody line with a treble clef there, right? So that's the melody. And then we have symbols above the melody that indicate what chord is to be played with those melodies. So these are called lead sheet symbols or chord symbols. And they tell you which chords to use underneath of those melody notes. So I know when I see that E with a minus sign that means to play an E minor chord underneath that melody. When I see that D sharp, or that B7 / D sharp, I know it means to play this. And when I see that G / D, I know it means to play this harmony. And so, someone who's trained in doing this can improvise an entire arrangement just based on reading that melody line and adding those chords. Okay. And so let's talk quickly about the different kinds of lead sheet symbols. And I think I mentioned this before, that there are a lot of different variations of lead sheet symbols because it's, a living, breathing notation system. So things are being changed all the time and added and fixed and modified. So there's really not any kind of, definitive method of creating lead sheet symbols, but there are some really common ones. So we already know the ones for triads, right? So for a major triad, you just write the letter by itself. So that indicates that A major triad. Minor triads have a lowercase m next to them. Diminished triads have the circle. And then augmented triads have the plus. For seventh chords, the lead sheet symbols are a little bit different than what we talked about with the other symbols that the book uses. And so in lead sheets, you'll often see major seventh chords indicated with a little triangle. Right? And that just means to play a major seventh chord. You'll also sometimes see it as an A, or the letter, and then a capital M with a 7. That means to do the same thing. This one, whenever you have the capital letter and then just a 7 by itself, that means to play a major minor seventh chord, or what's called a dominant seventh chord. Right? So dominant seventh chords are the default with lead sheet symbols. Every other kind of seventh chord is some kind of modification of the dominant, right? Okay, so just A, or a letter with a 7 means a dominant seventh chord or a major minor seventh chord. For minor seventh chords, sometimes you'll see a minus sign. So A minus 7, right? That just means minor seventh. Or you also see an A lowercase m with a 7. That means the same thing. You'll often see the letter and a little circle with a half slash through it, right? That means to play a half diminished seventh chord. That can also be indicated in another way. You can have a symbol that is telling you to play an A minor 7 flat 5, right? The flat doesn't necessarily mean that the note is flatted, but it means that it's lowered. So what we're doing is we're, thinking about playing the A minor 7th chord, which is in the measure before, and we're lowering the 5th. And that's the same thing as a half diminished 7th chord. And then finally, the fully diminished 7 is just usually that little circle without the little slash through it, because it's fully diminished this time. Or you can see it as A dim 7. And there are a lot of different ways that chords can be indicated, like I said, especially 7th chords. So this isn't all of the symbols, and this isn't even all of the chords. This is just a small little sample. Often you'll have a different bass note than what is in the root position form of the chord. And so, for example, over here, we have what looks like an A major triad with a G as the lowest note. So what we'll often do in that case is say that this is an A/G, which just means that the G is the lowest note, not the A. You can also use it to indicate an inversion, like over here. So this is a second inversion A major triad, but we don't write that in lead sheet symbols. Instead, we write A, and then we're saying that a different part of the chord is in the bass. So that part of the chord is E. So that's how you would indicate different inversions with this style of chords. Okay, and then finally, one thing that can kind of get confusing is trying to find out what chord we have in a texture where the notes aren't all stacked up like we've had. Okay, so sometimes the parts of the chord will be spread out across more than one staff or rearranged in some other way, such as this, right? So this is a chord, obviously, but it's not a nice, snowman looking thing where we have a stack of thirds. It's all kind of spread out. So you may not be able to just look at this and know what chord it is. So when you're first starting out, you need to kind of follow some steps. And the first thing is to find the lowest note, because that will tell you, sometimes it'll tell you the root, but either way it will tell you the bass note, right? The lowest note. So where to start. And it will always be the lowest note. It doesn't matter how the other notes are arranged. In our style in the style of music that we're studying in this class, what's really important is the note that's in the bass. That determines what position the triad is in and how it works in the music. So the bass is like one of the most important things when it comes to harmony. So we want to find what the lowest note is first. And so in this case, the lowest note is an E. So you could write that on a staff somewhere. You could keep that in your head, right? But just be aware that the lowest note is the most important thing that we need to find first. Then you want to take stock of all the other notes, but ignore any notes that might have the same letter name. So there's not anything like that here, but if we had like an E in the bass and then an E somewhere else, right, we would ignore the other E, because there's really no point in repeating things that are the same letter name. So in this chord, right, if we totaled them all up, we'd have an E, a B flat, a G, and a C, right? So you want to take those notes and then rearrange them so that they're all within an octave. So the next highest note in this chord is not that B flat above that E, right? The next highest note is actually the G, which is on the top staff there in the treble clef. So that's the next note we want to think about when we're trying to figure out this chord. Then the next highest one would be the B flat. And then the highest note in this chord is the C. And that C doesn't necessarily have to be on top of this voicing, right? But when we rearrange it so that it's all in an octave, this is what it would look like. And now you can see that this kind of looks like a triad or a seventh chord because it's all been squashed down so that it fits within an octave. So now we can easily figure out what this is, which is a C7, right, slash E, which is just a C7 chord in first inversion. All right. So a lot of stuff here, but this is the last thing we'll be doing with chords for the moment, and the last thing before our exam. So make sure that you check out the exam in the next module. If you have any questions about this video or anything else in the reading or the quiz, you can ask in the Zoom session or post it to the discussion forum. Yeah, and other than that, I hope you enjoyed this and have a great day.